They gave us 3 hours in the holding corridor before the assessment began. 3 hours is a long time to watch 37 alien cadets fall apart. Not dramatically, not all at once. The deterioration was quiet, the kind that happens to people who have been told their whole lives that they are exceptional, and who are now sitting in a corridor that smells faintly of ionized metal and old fear, waiting for a machine to look inside their heads and measure the distance between who they believe they are and who they actually are. It does things to a person, that kind of waiting. I watched a Velhari cadet, big, pale blue, with the ridged spines along his jaw that his species uses for threat displays, sit completely still for the first 90 minutes, then start rotating his wrists in tiny circles, over and over, not aware he was doing it. I watched 2 Druthari girls in the far corner speaking too quietly for me to catch the words, their filament tendrils interlacing the way their species does when they're grounding each other against something they can't name and don't want to look at directly. I watched a Cassin cadet, a species famous across 9 systems for its neural architecture, the ones who can hold 17 simultaneous cognitive tracks without effort, pull a small smooth stone from his tunic pocket and begin pressing it rhythmically into his palm, over and over, slow and deliberate, the way you work a muscle that has started to cramp. I sat with my back against the wall and finished the last of my ration bar and watched all of this and did not find it unkind. Fear before an assessment is honest. Fear before the resonance assessment at Veth Kalos Academy was, if anything, the most rational response a person could have. The probe was real. The numbers it produced were real. The consequences of those numbers were real. There was nothing irrational about sitting in a corridor and being afraid of all of that. The cadets who bothered me slightly were the ones holding it together through pure performance of control, the ones with the stiff backs and carefully neutral expressions, practicing a composure they did not actually feel. Not because the performance was wrong exactly, because the machine they were about to sit in front of would not be moved by it. The probe did not measure how you looked. It measured what was actually there. I had been at Veth Kalos for 6 weeks. I knew what the assessment was. Everyone at Veth Kalos knew what it was. The formal name was the Resonance Cognitive Architecture Survey, RCAS in the paperwork. The scan to everyone who wasn't a proctor. It was mandatory for every cadet who entered through the general intake track, which meant it was mandatory for every cadet except the directorate-sponsored ones, who had their assessments done before they arrived, and whose results were already on file, and whose placement in advanced cohorts was settled before they set foot on the grounds. The general intake cadets, which was me, which was the Velhari with the wrist circles, which was the Druthari pair and the Cassin with his stone, sat in holding corridors and waited for it. The scan worked by mapping. That was the simplest way to put it. A resonance probe, a physical device, about the size of a closed fist, suspended on an articulated arm above a reclined assessment chair, emitted a structured signal that could read with extraordinary precision the neural and bioelectric architecture of any sufficiently complex cognitive organism. It was not telepathy. It did not read thoughts. What it read was shape, the contours of a mind's response architecture, the load-bearing structures of attention and endurance and fear. It could find where a mind's weight rested. It could find where the floor was. And then it handed those findings to the proctors, who handed them to the Academy's placement algorithm, which decided where you went and what you were assigned to do for the next 4 years of your life. The floor measurement was the one that mattered. Every mind, the theory went, has a point at which sustained cognitive pressure becomes unsustainable, where the architecture begins to buckle, and the organism begins to respond in ways it would not choose if it were not at that depth. The probe would increase signal intensity in structured increments, mapping the cadet's response architecture at each level until it found that point. The point was expressed as a standardized unit the Academy called resonance depth, or RD. High RD meant you could hold up under the kind of sustained cognitive stress that field command generated. The weight of incomplete information, irreversible decisions, ongoing uncertainty, and the knowledge that what you chose would be acted upon. Low RD meant you were better suited to roles where the load was more distributed and the peaks less extreme. There was no official shame in either number. Unofficially, Veth Kalos being Veth Kalos, the cadets with high RD numbers ate at the tables nearest the windows and wore that fact in the angle of their chin when they moved through the main corridor. The highest RD ever recorded at Veth Kalos, according to the Academy's Public History Archive, was 340, achieved by a Druthari general named Vessel of Stillwater, who had gone on to command the 6th Coherence Fleet and whose portrait hung in the main atrium above a small brass plate that said, "In 4 languages, depth is not gifted. It is built." The median for general intake cadets was around 85. The median for general intake cadets who had also completed prior service, combat veterans coming back through the system for formal credentialing, which was the track I had entered on, was around 130. Higher floor, more scar tissue built into the architecture, more experience carrying weight that would have buckled someone younger. I was 31. I had done 11 years of contract survey work in contested deep space corridors before someone at the Veth Kalos admissions office had looked at my file and determined, apparently, that what I had been doing was close enough to military service to qualify me for the veteran intake track. I had not argued the point. It was close enough. Closer, possibly, than the admissions office fully understood when they made the call. I did not spend the 3 hours in the corridor thinking about the assessment. There was nothing useful I could do with that thinking. I could not change what the probe would find. I could not prepare for it in any meaningful way. The whole point of the probe was that preparation was irrelevant to it. You either had the architecture or you didn't. The probe would find out which. My thinking about it in advance would have no effect on the result. So I finished my ration bar, and I watched the other cadets and I waited. The corridor door opened at the 3rd hour, and a proctor stepped through. She was Vethani, the species the Academy was named for, though the institution had long since expanded past its founding species exclusive control. Vethani were tall, gray-skinned, with eyes that had no whites, just a deep amber iris that occupied most of the visible socket, giving them a look of perpetual and slightly unsettling focus. This one wore the proctor's banded collar and carried a data slate, and she looked at the room the way someone looks at a processing task they have performed many times before and intend to perform competently, and without unnecessary drama. "Resonance assessment begins in 4 minutes," she said. "Cadets will enter in the order of the intake number on your wristband. When called, you will enter the assessment chamber, take the chair, and remain still. The probe will complete its work. You will be released when the assessment is done. Average duration is 12 to 18 minutes per cadet. Outliers at either end should not read anything into the duration of their own session." She looked up from the slate. "Any questions about the procedure?" Silence. "Good," she looked back down. "Cadet Davin Osai." I stood up. Several heads turned. I was the only human in the cohort. I had been the only human in every room I had occupied since arriving at Veth Kalos, except for a brief afternoon 3 weeks prior when 2 human cadets from the engineering track had sat near me in the cafeteria, and we had talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular before going our separate ways. The Academy had exactly 9 human cadets in total, out of a general population of roughly 400. We were not common. We were not expected. The Academy's literature made a point of noting that human enrollment had been growing steadily, which was the institutional way of acknowledging that it was still unusual enough to mention without saying so directly. The proctor did not react to my standing. She gestured toward the door. I followed her through. The assessment chamber was smaller than I had expected and significantly quieter. The walls were a pale silvery composite that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. The kind of material engineered specifically to remove the ambient noise of other people's distress from an environment where distress is a routine occurrence. The chair in the center was reclined at about 30 degrees, heavily padded, with a shallow headrest designed for species with ridge anatomy along the back of the skull. It would not fit me especially well. Above the chair, suspended on a segmented arm from the ceiling, was the probe, a matte gray ovoid about the size of my two fists together, with a faint internal luminescence that pulsed very slowly, like something alive that was simply resting, not yet doing anything specific. Two additional proctors stood at a curved console along one wall, both Vethani, both watching their display screens with the amber-eyed focus that characterized their species even in completely routine moments. The proctor who had led me gestured at the chair. I sat down. The headrest was not designed for human skull anatomy, but I found a stable position, settled my shoulders, let my hands rest in my lap, breathed once with intention, and stopped thinking about the chair. "The probe will begin on my mark," said the proctor at the console on the left, in the careful articulation of someone who has been trained to deliver this instruction clearly enough that nothing in it can be misheard. "During the assessment, you will experience a variety of cognitive stimuli. Some will be disorienting, some will be uncomfortable. This is the nature of the mapping process. You are not required to resist. You are not being graded on resistance. You are asked simply to remain in the chair and remain as still as possible." "Understood," I said. He glanced at me briefly. Most of the alien staff at Veth Kalos glanced at me briefly at first. Not hostility, not overt curiosity, but the automatic recalibration of a pattern recognition system encountering something outside its trained parameters. "Beginning," he said. The probe descended perhaps 6 inches on its arm, settling about a foot above my forehead. The pulsing slowed, then steadied, then changed quality, became less like something visible and more like a pressure, the way you sometimes feel the bass register of sound through a floor rather than through your ears, a vibration that bypasses the usual channels and goes directly into the body's sensing apparatus. It was not painful. It was not nothing, either. It was a presence. Something attentive, methodical, doing its work. I closed my eyes and waited. The first thing I felt was the mapping itself. I have no better word for it. It wasn't an image, a sound, or a sensation I could attach to prior experience precisely. It was closer to the sensation of something paying very close, very systematic attention to the interior of my head. Not hostile attention, professional attention. The way a surveyor runs instruments over terrain, not to alter it but to understand it completely. I have spent 11 years running instruments over terrain. I recognized the quality of the attention, at least by analogy, and I did not find it threatening. Strange, yes. Threatening, no. I have been in many strange situations. Some of them were threatening and some were not, and the capacity to distinguish between those two categories quickly and accurately has been, in 11 years, one of the most practically valuable things I developed. The probe was strange. It was not threatening. After roughly a minute, the mapping intensified. I felt the first clear indicator of what the proctor had described as cognitive stimuli. Not an image or a thought, but a kind of weight pressing inward, as if the air pressure in the room had increased by a small but definite degree. My nervous system registered it as the preliminary signature of stress. The body paying closer attention, diverting a small additional allocation of resource, putting secondary systems on notice that something might be developing. I let it make those preparations and did not direct them. The preparations were accurate and reasonable. There was something developing. The preparations were not required to become anything beyond preparations. I know what stress feels like. I know it the way you know any tool you have worked with for a long time, its weight, its balance, the kinds of resistance it offers and the kinds it doesn't. I know what it feels like in the first 30 seconds, when the body is deciding whether the situation is serious or can be reclassified as not serious with a little more information. I know what it feels like at the 4-hour mark, when the body has decided the situation is ongoing and has shifted from acute response into the harder, quieter register of sustained management. The mode that is less dramatic than the first 30 seconds, but considerably more expensive to maintain. I know what it feels like at the 12-hour mark, when most of the acute responses have burned through their resource, and what remains is something closer to a steady state of functional endurance, not comfortable, not all right, but operating. Still operating. I know what it feels like at the 30-hour mark, when the distinction between yourself and the situation has begun to blur at the edges, because you have been inside it long enough that you cannot clearly remember a time when you were not. I know the whole shape of stress, from the first edge of it to the deep interior of it. I have lived in most of its rooms. Some of them I have lived in long enough to have opinions about the quality of the light. The weight pressed harder. I breathed slowly and did not resist it and did not catastrophize it. I filed it beside the thing it most closely resembled in my memory. The pressure of a long decompression hold in a compromised survey station on the fourth moon of Veth Halos IV, where I had spent 19 consecutive hours waiting for a structural integrity reading that I had not been sure would come back green. That had also been a kind of sustained wait with no clear endpoint and no mechanism to reduce it by wanting it reduced. I had read through most of a technical manual and eaten 2 ration packs, and slept 4 hours in a chair that was considerably less comfortable than this one. And then the reading had come back green, and I had packed my instruments and moved on without ceremony, the way you move on from things that turned out to be survivable. The probe's weight did not have a visible endpoint. That was fine. I am not dependent on knowing the endpoint. I have spent 11 years operating without knowing the endpoint. I filed the current situation next to the one it most closely resembled, noted that it too would eventually resolve, and moved on. The pressure increased again. I was aware, in the peripheral way you become aware of things when you are not fighting them, that this was probably the level at which most cadets began to show the probe something it could measure. A clear response signature, the body's first definite signal that the load was becoming meaningful, that the organism was genuinely engaging with the stimulus rather than simply absorbing it at its outer edges. I was also aware, in the same peripheral way, that my body had not issued that signal. It was still waiting. It had stored the pressure the way a good storage system stores anything, completely, without commentary, ready to retrieve it if retrieval becomes necessary, making no claim about when retrieval would be appropriate. The probe seemed to register this. Or rather, more precisely, the probe found that the current increment was not producing the expected response pattern and moved to the next one. I have thought about this moment in the years since, and I think the most honest description of it is that the probe was encountering something it had not been designed to encounter, not because the probe was poorly designed. The opposite. It was an excellent instrument, well calibrated, built by people who had a thorough understanding of cognitive architecture across dozens of species. The issue was simply that the range of its design reflected the range of experience the designers had thought to account for. They had accounted for cadets with high innate tolerance. They had accounted for cadets who had undergone training programs designed to build resilience. They had accounted for veterans with genuine combat experience. What they had not specifically accounted for, what had been noted as theoretical but not built into the instrument's primary taxonomy, was an architecture that had been stress-conditioned, incrementally, over an extended period, by conditions that were not specifically designed to condition it, and which had no particular endpoint or graduation point. Conditions that just were, and kept being, and required the organism inside them to keep functioning regardless. The probe was looking for the floor. The floor was the point at which the architecture yielded. It had been designed around the assumption that every architecture had such a point within a reasonable measurement range. That was a reasonable assumption. It was accurate for every architecture the probe had ever encountered, until mine. The probe was not wrong to make the assumption. It was working correctly. It was simply finding that the assumption did not apply in this case, and it was doing what a good instrument does when it encounters an anomalous result. It continued working methodically through its full range, not because it expected to find the answer further up, but because thoroughness is the discipline of an honest instrument. I felt the increase before it arrived. A slight change in the quality of the signal, a preparatory shift, like the moment before a wave breaks when you can feel the water gathering itself behind what is about to happen. Then it happened, and it was noticeably heavier than anything prior to it, and my body registered the spike the way a well-calibrated instrument registers a genuine anomaly. Cleanly, without drama, noting the change, logging it, adjusting its operating baseline to account for the new parameter, and then continuing to operate at the new baseline as if that were the only baseline it had ever known. I heard something from the direction of the console, not words, just the tone of an exchange, brief, quiet. The pressure held at the new level for some time. I do not know how long precisely. Time in sustained pressure situations is not reliable to track because the mind is occupied and stops counting in the ordinary way. You exist inside the situation rather than watching yourself exist in it, and the watching is what produces the timekeeping. I existed in the pressure the way you exist in a long transit, not absent, not unconscious, but not tracking every second. Present, patient, not requiring the situation to resolve on any particular schedule. There is a specific quality to that kind of patience that I have never found a satisfactory word for. It is not resignation. Resignation implies that you have given something up, that there was a state you wanted and you have accepted that you won't reach it. This is different. It is more like the patience of someone who is very good at waiting because they have discovered, through extended practice, that waiting is not an activity that requires much from them. The body breathes. The mind processes what is present. The situation continues. Eventually, the situation ends as all situations end. This has proven true every time it has been relevant. I have no reason to doubt it will prove true again. It increased again. This time, I felt something I could only describe as the probe searching. Not just applying pressure downward, but moving through the architecture. The way a hand pressing on a surface moves around that surface when the downward pressure is not yielding the expected give, testing for the soft spot, the place where the resistance is organized differently, where the load is held less well. I felt it search. I felt it find endurance where it expected to find limit. I felt it move again, finding more endurance beneath that, and then more beneath that, layered the way geological strata are layered, not uniform, not clean but dense, compacted by time and pressure and the specific history of having been loaded before and having held and having then been loaded again. Another exchange from the console, longer, more than two voices. I did not open my eyes. The probe increased at intervals that seemed to be shortening. The algorithm working through its range the way a technician works through a diagnostic protocol, systematically, not skipping levels. Each level confirmed before moving to the next. Each increase I absorbed. Each time I absorbed it, my body adjusted its baseline, and the new pressure became the normal operating condition, and I waited for whatever came after it. I thought, in the intervals between increments, about things I thought about when I was in sustained pressure situations and had no specific requirement on my attention. I thought about the Castanese corridor survey, where I had spent 43 hours in a pressure suit on the surface of a tidally locked rock, waiting for a survey drone that might or might not come back. The drone had been carrying the only copy of the navigational data I needed to complete the contract and get off the rock. If it didn't come back, The backup plan was a low-probability sequence that I had run through carefully and found technically feasible and genuinely unpleasant. I had sat in the suit in the dark on the wrong side of the planet from any light source, and I had waited. Not because waiting was comfortable, because waiting was what the situation required, and when the situation requires a thing, you do the thing. The drone had come back. I thought about a contract 2 years before that, on a station in the Veth Halos corridor that had been certified habitable by the survey company that built it, and which had turned out to have a thermal regulation flaw that, under certain load conditions, reduced interior temperature to approximately 40 below the comfort range of most species, including mine, for periods of 6 to 9 hours before the system corrected itself. The station's operators were aware of this. They had included it in the fine print of the contract documentation, which I had not read carefully enough before signing. I had discovered the flaw at the beginning of my second overnight shift, when the temperature dropped fast and kept dropping, and I was in a part of the station where the emergency warming equipment was not stored. I had spent the next 7 hours managing that situation with the resources I had, which were not ideal but were sufficient, and when the system corrected itself and the temperature came back up, I had finished my shift and then my contract, and then filed a detailed complaint with the survey company's safety division, and they had updated the fine print. I had not found the experience pleasant at any point. I had also not found it unsurvivable, which is the criterion that actually matters. I thought about these things not because they were relevant to the probe, or because thinking about them changed anything about the situation I was currently in. I thought about them the way you might flip through the pages of a reference document you have used many times before, not looking for anything specific, just keeping the material accessible, reminding yourself that you have been here before, that the contours of this are familiar, that the document is long and well indexed, and you have found your way through it successfully every previous time. The probe pressed harder than it had pressed at any point in the session. I absorbed it. It pressed harder still. I absorbed that too. The mechanism of absorption is not comfort. It is not the absence of difficulty or the pretense that the difficulty isn't real. It is the continuation of function under conditions that are genuinely difficult, which is a different thing from the conditions not existing, and a different thing from being unaffected by them. The difficulty was real. The absorption of it was also real. Both things were true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other. I thought briefly, without urgency, about the debrief after the Castanese corridor contract. The company medical officer had run a standard post-mission stress response evaluation. He had asked the standard questions, administered the standard instruments, then looked at the results, then looked at me with a specific quality of look that I had filed at the time as routine, and was now, with better context, revisiting. I thought he had encountered something in the data that he did not have a frame for, and had chosen, pragmatically, to proceed as if he had won, because the practical path forward was clearance, not documentation of an anomaly that was not harming anyone. I thought he had written, cleared for next rotation in his notes, and meant it in both senses of the phrase. Administratively cleared, and genuinely clear in his own mind that sending me back out was the right call, whatever the data said. He had been right on both counts. The room was quiet in a specific way, the way a room gets quiet when the people in it have moved past professional attention into something more personal, more genuinely confounded. I have been in rooms that were quiet like that before. Usually they were rooms where something was happening that the people in the room had no pre-existing frame for, and were trying, in real time, to construct one. I have been in rooms that were quiet like that before. Usually they were rooms where something was happening that the people in the room had no pre-existing frame for, and were trying, in real time, to construct one. I opened my eyes. The two original proctors were both standing rather than sitting at the console. The one with the deeper voice had a data slate in his hand, and was looking at it with an expression I had learned in 6 weeks at Veth Halos, was the Vethani equivalent of genuine confoundment. A slight inward pressure of the brow ridge, a stillness of the jaw muscles, the amber eyes wider than their resting state by a degree that was, in a species that communicates as much through eye state as through language, more than incidental. A third proctor, older, with the senior banding on her collar, had come in at some point while my eyes were closed and stood at the back of the room, also watching a data slate, with the same expression, more of it. The door behind her was open. 2 more people in the corridor were looking in through it. One was the proctor who had brought me from the holding room. The other was someone in staff clothing I did not recognize, standing at the angle of a person who had been passing by and stopped. I looked up at the probe. It was still going. "How long has it been?" I asked. The proctor with the deep voice looked up from his slate. He appeared to locate the question after a moment of reorientation. 51 minutes, he said. The average was 12 to 18. "Is it close to done?" I asked. He looked at the older proctor. She looked at him. Something passed between them in the register of an internal institutional conversation that had no public form. "The probe," he said carefully, "is still mapping." "All right," I said. I closed my eyes again. "Let me know when it finishes." A silence that was a different quality from the silences before it. Then the senior proctor spoke from the back of the room. Her voice was measured and deliberate, the voice of someone who chooses words rather than produces them, who has developed the habit of precision, because imprecision has cost something at some point in her career. "Cadet Osai," she said, "I am Subdirector Thavinel. I oversee the assessment cohort for this intake cycle. I'd like to ask you a question." "Of course," I said. "Have you undergone resonance assessment before? Of any kind on Earth, or at any institution prior to Veth Kalos?" "No," I said, "this is my first." A processing pause. "Have you undergone any other form of cognitive architecture evaluation? Any kind of structured neural stress response measurement that might have created prior conditioning to a signal of this type?" I thought about the company medical officer, about his notes, about the particular quality of his look. "Not that I'm aware of," I said. Which was the truth. I was not aware of anything specific. I was simply what I was. "Thank you," she said. The probe continued. The proctors continued to watch their displays. The people in the corridor continued to stand there. Nobody said anything else. I closed my eyes again and waited. 20 more minutes passed. In total, the session ran 71 minutes. When the probe powered down, the luminescence faded from it gradually, like a coal cooling. The arm retracted. The acoustic quality of the room shifted slightly, as whatever the probe had been adding to the air stopped being added. Subdirector Thavinel came to stand near the chair. "The assessment is complete," she said. "What's the result?" I said. She held the data slate where I could read it. The RD field displayed 3 characters. NI below that, in the notation field, was a longer block of text in the standard notation of the Academy's administrative system. Resonance depth, not INSTRUMENTABLE within current survey parameters. Cadet present stress architecture consistent with extended acute exposure beyond design range of assessment tool. Manual classification protocol article 7C applies. Placement to be determined BY Directorate review. I read it twice. NI, I said. Non-instrumentable. "That is the designation," she said. "The probe couldn't find a floor." "The probe completed its full operational range," she said. "Within that range, it did not find a floor. The instrument measures to a defined ceiling. You were above it," she paused, "significantly above it based on the session log." I handed the slate back and looked at the probe, which was now fully retracted and inert, and appeared perfectly ordinary. "What happens now?" I said. "Now," she said, "we consult the manual." She meant it literally. The directorate review was scheduled for 4 days later. In those 4 days, I became, in a quiet institutional way, a subject of interest. Not celebrity. Veth Kalos was not structured for celebrity. The culture was too focused on output and visible performance to leave much room for ambient social attention as its own category. What happened instead was something more specific. I became a data point the institution was actively processing, in real time, with incomplete prior models to work from. I noticed it in the way conversations in my vicinity sometimes paused when I arrived, or in the way a proctor I had never met would hold eye contact for an additional half-second. The assessment results were technically confidential. In an environment of 400 cadets and several hundred staff sharing the same facilities, confidentiality is an aspiration. On the second day, the Velhari cadet found me in the main corridor between the eastern classroom block and the equipment storage wing. He introduced himself as Get of Selm, third-generation Veth Kalos, grandfather in the Outer Coherence Command, mother currently serving in the Vanguard. He had expected an RD in the mid-200s based on family precedent, and had received 187, which was high, but not the number he had built around. He told me all of this in the trading pigeon that most interspecies cadets used as common ground, quickly, in the way of someone establishing a factual foundation before moving to the actual point. The actual point was, what did you get? I said. He looked at me, what is that? It means the probe couldn't complete the measurement within its range. He thought about this for a moment. The wrist rotation had started and then stopped, as it always did when he caught himself. The probe didn't find a floor, he said, not a question, testing whether he had understood correctly. Correct. He was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, but the silence of someone applying genuine attention to a problem they haven't encountered before. My grandfather, he said eventually, used to say that the probe is the most honest thing in this academy. No politics, no preferences, no investment in the result. It finds what is there and reports it completely accurately. He looked at me with the amber-eyed Velhari regard. He would have said that a result like yours, whatever it means, is the probe being honest about something it found, and that honest findings are worth more than any particular number. I believe that, I said. He would also have said, Getavar continued with a slight change of register, that the thing it found didn't come from nowhere. That kind of architecture doesn't develop without history. He paused. That's not a question. You don't have to respond to it. I know, I said. I'll see you in morning formation, he said. See you there, I said. On the third day, 2 things happened. The first was that the Kassin cadet, the one with the stone, sat down across from me in the cafeteria without asking, which among Kassin is an expression of direct social interest rather than presumption. He had received an RD of 241, which had placed him in the command candidate track, and which he clearly felt represented the accurate measurement of something real about him. He was not boastful about this. He was precise about it, the way Kassin are precise about most things. He asked me a series of careful questions about the human cognitive architecture, specifically about how human nervous systems process sustained ambiguity, and he listened to my answers with all 17 of his cognitive tracks clearly engaged, which, for the Kassin, looks something like a person going very still, while a great deal of machinery operates quietly behind their eyes. At the end of the conversation he said, the probe's notation suggests an architecture that has been stress-conditioned at depth. In Kassin physiological science, stress conditioning produces demonstrably different response profiles than either innate high tolerance or trained high tolerance. Conditioned depth is structurally distinct. The probe, evidently, has no category for it. Apparently not, I said. That is a gap in the probe's taxonomy, he said, not in you. He picked up his tray and left. The second thing that happened on the third day was that the proctor who had led me from the holding corridor, the one who had stood in the doorway and watched the rest of the session, found me in the library wing in the late afternoon. She had been off duty long enough to have changed out of her proctor banding, but the posture remained, the same efficient uprightness. She sat down across the table from me without preamble. "I have administered 437 assessments," she said. "In 11 years, I want you to know that as context." "All right," I said. "The probe has never said what it said yesterday." "Not once in 437 sessions." She looked at me with the amber-eyed Vethani regard that always appeared more intense than it was because the architecture of their faces provided no neutral state. They were always, unavoidably, looking. "I am off duty. This is not an official conversation. I wanted to say something to you that I think would not be said in an official context." I waited. "The probe is not a sentimental instrument," she said. "It does not produce results that are generous or optimistic. It produces results that are accurate. If the probe says the depth is unresolved, the depth is genuinely unresolved. There is no version of that result that is exaggerated or aspirational." She paused. "I have spent 11 years watching cadets sit in that chair and be measured and come out with numbers. Some of the numbers are very high. Some of those cadets go on to do genuinely impressive things. But in 11 years I have always known, watching the session log, approximately where the number would land. I can see the floor approaching in the data. It is legible." She stopped. "Yesterday I could not see it approaching. I watched the log for 71 minutes and I could not see it approaching." I did not say anything. "That is all I wanted to say," she said. "I thought you should know that from someone who reads those logs professionally and knows what they look like." She stood. "Good luck with the directorate review." She left. I sat in the library for another 30 minutes and read through the chapter I had been working on, about navigational mathematics in constrained transit corridors, and when I had reached a good stopping point, I closed the book and went to dinner. On the fourth day, I went back to the atrium after dinner and stood in front of the portrait again for a while. Not because I expected it to tell me something it hadn't told me before, because I had more context for it now, and I wanted to look at it with that context. Depth is not gifted, it is built. Vessel of Stillwater had built an RD of 340 over a lifetime of deliberate effort, training programs designed to extend the limits, command assignments that stretched the architecture, decades of sustained attention to the question of what the outer edge of one's own capacity felt like and how to push it further. The building was intentional. The destination was known. The path toward it had been chosen by someone who understood what they were building and why. I had not been building anything. I had been doing my job in conditions that happened to require the kind of endurance that the job required, and the architecture had changed the way architecture changes when it is loaded, not because I understood the process or was directing it, but because the load was there, and the alternative to holding it was not available. That was different from what Vessel of Stillwater had done. I did not know whether it was lesser or greater. I was not sure the comparison was meaningful. What I knew was that the probe had found something it could not quantify. That was a factual statement about the probe and about me simultaneously, and both parts of it were accurate. I went to bed at the usual hour and slept without difficulty. The directorate review was held in one of the upper-level administrative chambers, a room with a long table and high ceilings, and the specific institutional quiet that comes from good acoustic engineering, and the accumulated weight of many serious conversations having occurred in the same space. 4 chairs were occupied when I arrived. Subdirector Thavinel was there. 2 other Vethani who wore the rank insignia of senior academy staff, one of whom I recognized from the staff directory as Director Vashin, head of intake and placement, and 1 human, which I had not anticipated, a woman in her mid-50s, close-cropped gray hair, with the bearing of someone who had spent a long time in uniform and who had not entirely finished being in uniform even after the uniform was gone. She introduced herself as Coordinator Vera Hatch of the Veth Kahlo's Human Liaison Office, and she shook my hand with the directness of someone who had made it a point to learn what that gesture communicated and who respected the communication. They had the assessment data in front of them, the NI notation, the Article 7C flag, the probe's full session log, which I had not seen before and which was, apparently, considerably more detailed than I had understood, a minute-by-minute record of signal levels and architectural response, rendered in the probe's own notation system, with anomaly flags beginning at the 40-minute mark and accumulating from there. Director Vashon opened the review without preamble. "Cadet Osai," he said, "Article 7C requires transparency with the cadet, so I want to be direct with you about what we are looking at." He set the session log where I could see it from across the table. The probe's record documents 87 minutes of continuous assessment at amplitude levels that have previously produced definitive floor readings in every cadet assessed in the 11 years this institution has administered the RCAS. 100% of prior cases. At the probe's maximum amplitude, the historical record shows a definitive response signature within 90 seconds in all cadets assessed. You were at maximum amplitude for 22 minutes. The probe did not find a floor. I looked at the log. At maximum amplitude, the architectural notation was architecture present depth unresolved. That notation, according to the small legend at the bottom of the page, had never appeared in a session log before mine. The probe's anomaly analysis, Director Vashon continued, includes a notation that the architectural pattern it recorded is consistent with what the design documentation refers to as chronic sustained stress integration. What that phrase means in practical terms is that your baseline tolerance is elevated not because you were born with extraordinary architecture, but because your architecture has been load-bearing for an extended period at levels that have altered its structural properties. The probe is not a diagnostic instrument. We are not making a clinical assessment. We are describing a structural observation. The floor the probe was designed to find does not appear to exist at the levels the probe can reach. "Because I've been below those levels," I said. "Yes," he said, "that appears to be the correct interpretation." Subdirector Thavenel said, "The probe's design documentation includes a theoretical discussion of this possibility. The designers considered it conceivable that an organism which had experienced sustained acute stress over a sufficiently extended period might develop architectural properties that fell outside the instrument's measurement range. They noted it as a theoretical edge case. In 11 years of operation, this is the first instance of it occurring." "They designed the probe with that possibility in mind," I said. "They noted it," she said. "They did not design a response protocol for it. Article 7C was written to cover procedural gaps of this kind, but it is broad. It gives the directorate discretion. It does not give us instructions." Coordinator Hatch said, from her end of the table, "So we are here to exercise discretion." "Yes," Director Vashon said. He was quiet for a moment. I had the impression of a man who had been in enough high-stakes rooms to know the value of not filling silences with noise. "I want to say something," he continued. "That is not strictly part of the procedural review, but which I think is relevant to your understanding of this situation. The resonance assessment has been in use at this institution for 11 years. In that time, we have assessed cadets from 34 species, with cognitive architectures that span a very wide range of innate properties. The probe was designed collaboratively by engineers from 7 of those species, specifically to account for that range. It is not a tool that was built for one kind of mind and then applied to others without adjustment. It was built with the full spectrum of known cognitive architecture as its design basis." He paused. "And it did not find your floor." I looked at him. "I want you to understand," he said, "that this is not a common result. It is not even a rare result in the ordinary sense. the way a very high number might be rare. It is a result that the instrument was not able to produce because the parameter it was designed to measure was not accessible within the instrument's range. That is a different kind of result. He looked at me steadily. In 30 years of working in military education, I have not encountered a different kind of result before. The room was quiet for a moment. So the question, I said, is where someone with that kind of result belongs. Yes, Director Vashon said. The program structure is built on RD ranges. Below 70, technical support and logistics. 70 to 150, standard operational track. 150 to 250, command candidate track. Above 250, the Directorate Academic Program, which is the most intensive program the Academy offers and which has historically drawn its cadets from the highest RD scores in each intake cycle. He folded his hands on the table. You do not fit within this structure, not because you fell short of any threshold, because the structure's thresholds do not extend to where you are. Your result sits above the upper bound of the distribution. Technically, Coordinator Hatch said, with the slight dryness of someone who has earned the right to it, you are above the instrument. We are placing you in the Directorate Academic Program, Director Vashon said. Article 7C authorizes this placement without the standard invitation protocol. The Directorate Academic Program is defined by the demands it makes on those who enter it. Our assessment is that those demands fall within your range. He paused. We are confident in that assessment, even without a number to support it. I thought about the other cadets in that program. The ones with 294, 281, and the others who qualified by conventional means and who would know I had not. They will know I have NI instead of a score, I said. They will, he said. What they make of it is their business. What you make of it is yours. He looked at me with the settled amber regard of someone who has thought about a problem carefully and arrived at a conclusion he is not second-guessing. I will tell you, for context, that the cadets who perform best in the Directorate Academic Program are not always the ones with the highest numbers. The numbers measure a property of the architecture at a point in time. They do not measure what a cadet does with that architecture under sustained load, in conditions where the load does not diminish on any announced schedule and the duration is not posted in advance. He paused. We will find out what you do with yours. Coordinator Hatch said, more quietly. The probe's design documentation notes that a mind which has integrated stress at the depth yours appears to have integrated it, is likely to function under sustained load in ways that are categorically different from a mind, which simply has never been tested to that depth. It does not say better, it says different. She looked at me directly. We are genuinely curious about what that means in practice. I think it's honest to tell you that. I appreciate honest, I said. I know, she said. Most people who have been where you've been do. I was released from the review chamber into the main corridor. It was mid-morning, and the traffic through the Academy's main passage was steady, cadets moving between buildings with the focused efficiency that Veth Kalos's culture encouraged, and that most of them had internalized well enough by 6 weeks that it no longer looked performed. Nobody looked at me specifically. Nobody yet knew what had been decided in the room behind me. I went to the atrium. The portrait hung in its usual place above the corridor junction, the central intersection that every cadet passed through multiple times every day, where the architects had apparently decided that the most prominent wall was the right place to put a permanent reminder of what this institution valued and what it believed about the relationship between effort and depth. Depth is not gifted. It is built. In 4 languages, for every species that moved through this space. I looked at it for a while. Vessel of Stillwater had built an RD of 340 over a lifetime of deliberate work. Training programs, command assignments, decade upon decade of sustained attention to the question of where the outer edge was and how to extend it. The building was intentional. The destination was understood in advance, at least in outline. The path toward it had been chosen by someone who had a clear model of what they were constructing and why. I had not been building anything with that kind of intention. I had been doing a job in conditions that required what they required, and the architecture had changed the way architecture changes under load, not because I was directing the process, but because the load was there, and the option to decline it was not available. Not heroically unavailable, practically unavailable. That is how most of the things that change a person happen, not through deliberate self-improvement programs, but through the ordinary requirements of situations that could not be argued with. The inscription said, "It is built." It did not specify by whom or whether the building was intentional or whether the person doing the building had any awareness that it was happening. It said built, not chosen. That was worth thinking about. I thought about the probe. I thought about the session log with its flat notation at maximum amplitude, architecture present, depth unresolved. I thought about the proctor who had found me in the library and told me, off the record, that she had been reading session logs for 11 years and had never not been able to see the floor approaching in the data. I thought about what it meant that she had watched for 71 minutes and not seen it. The probe had not been wrong. It had been looking for something real. The floor is real. I have no reason to believe I don't have one. I simply have not found it yet. Neither had the probe. That was an accurate statement of the facts, and accurate statements of the facts are the most useful things you can have when you are trying to understand a situation. What I could say, accurately, 11 years of particular kinds of work had produced a particular kind of architecture. The architecture had a property that the probe's measurement range did not encompass. The directorate had looked at this and decided it was a property that belonged in their most demanding program rather than outside the structure entirely. What I could not say, what the directorate academic program would actually ask of me, or whether the architecture would hold up when asked to do something more structured and deliberate than just continuing to exist under difficult conditions. Continuing to exist is different from performing. I knew the former. I had not tested the latter in this context. That was, as far as I could tell, exactly what the next 4 years were designed to find out. I walked to my next class. Tactical Spatial Reasoning. The Kassan instructor who taught it covered material quickly, densely, without repetition. The teaching manner of someone who believed the content was more interesting than the performance of delivering it. I had found, after 11 years in an industry where people often performed their expertise more than they exercised it, that I had a strong preference for the latter. I was early. I took my seat toward the back, opened my notes from the previous session, and read through them, filing the parts I understood well and marking the parts I had understood only adequately, because the difference mattered. Gedivar came in close to the start of the session. He took his usual seat 2 rows ahead and then turned and saw me. He looked at me for a moment with the expression I had come to catalog as his Velhari reassessment, not the social performance of accepting something, but the actual internal process of updating a model. He nodded once. I nodded back. The instructor arrived. The session began. I opened my notebook to a fresh page, wrote the date at the top, and settled in to pay attention, because the material was worth the attention and the hour would not extend itself for anyone. Outside in the atrium, the portrait hung in its place. The brass plate made its claim. In the assessment chamber down the long corridor, the probe waited in its resting state, that slow internal pulse, not a heartbeat but something that resembled one, the low readiness of an instrument that has completed its work for the day and is available to begin again whenever the next subject arrives. It had not found my floor. It had looked carefully and completely, from the first level to the last, with instruments built by people who had thought seriously about the outer limits of what any mind could hold, and at the end of its full range it had found me still there, present, intact, architecture unresolved, depth beyond what it was built to reach. That was not a failure of the probe. The probe was honest. It measured what it could measure and named what it couldn't with precision and without drama, and the result it had produced was a true and accurate description of what it had found. What it had found was absence of a floor within its range. I did not know where my floor was, either. I had simply never found it. 11 years of situations that had pressed toward it, and it had not appeared. That was not strength I had chosen. It was structure I had accumulated. The way material accumulates structural properties under repeated load, until the material is something different than it started as, and the difference is not something you can see from the outside until something tries to test it. The probe had tried to test it. The probe had sent back, depth unresolved. I filed that beside everything else I knew about myself. The things the surveys had confirmed, the things experience had taught, the things I carried without knowing quite what to call them. One more data point in a file that was longer than I usually thought about. One more accurate reading from an honest instrument. The instructor at the front of the room called the first question of the session. I looked down at my notebook, where the date was written at the top of a blank page, and I began to write.